Good evening, everybody. Welcome. It's nice to see you zooming in.
Hello.
Hi, Penny. Hi, Bob. Hi, Rita.
Hello.
Hi, Gail. Hi, Greg. And all of you whose faces I can't see, but whose names. Hey, Mont.
Hello. Hi, Chris.
Good to see everybody. I'm watching an almost visible sun setting out my window here. It's clear there's a sun there. You just can't really see it through the clouds. Hi, Don. Hello. Hello. Everybody zooming in. We'll wait about another minute because we normally have a few extra folks zoom in, so we'll give it a couple of minutes here.
Well, hi, Chris. I haven't seen you guys in a while.
Nice. Now can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Good to
Hi,
see
Penny.
you.
Are you still at Target? Because I never see you there.
That's because I haven't been working.
Oh,
COVID kind of made me decide that I didn't want to take any risks.
well, you were smart.
So, you know,
Oh, that's good.
my kids told me that I didn't make enough money to make it worth my risk.
Yeah.
I never felt old before pandemic, and now, like Penny, like you, Mike, our kids are treating us like we're a million years old and at extremely high risk for disease.
Oh, you would have loved it. She was doing this calculation of, okay, so if you make this much money and even if you quit and you want to go back and you don't get the same pay, I mean, Mom, really, is it worth X number of dollars?
She's so wise.
You know, my son just says, Mom, think about it. Do you really want to take that chance when you don't have to? He went the emotional route. She went the analytical amount.
Oh, good kids. You taught them well.
Well, it's good to see you guys.
Oh. It's nice. Someday we're going to get back to church when we can sing. We can sing.
Yes.
We will sing.
Oh, good.
Someday.
Why go to church if you can't sing?
Who's that? That's a thought.
I'm assuming we'll be singing at Easter outside.
I don't know. Will we?
We will be
At the
singing at Easter outside.
can always-
You'll need to
You
be
can always
masked,
sing at the drive-in.
but you can always
No.
sing at the drive-in.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
What's that?
Just have to wear a mask.
Oh, this is Trinity.
And I don't know about you guys, but I sound really good singing with a mask. It's like being in the shower.
I'm gonna be.
All right, I'm going to kick it over to Pastor Peter here to get us started.
It's like having a mute on the trumpet. That's too loud.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to worship during this Lenten season. We're really glad that you've joined us. We're really glad, too, that we have a special guest speaker tonight, Daphne Corbett, who's going to share a little bit about her experience in the Holy Land, which I know is a place not just for our biblical imagination, but for a lot of the folks at Trinity who've taken trips there too, and seen the wonders of the places where Jesus hung out. So really good to have you with us, and we'll begin our worship tonight with some music and walking and being a part of the ways that Jesus is with us right now. And definitely feel free to sing along. Is it working?
I'm not hearing anything.
No,
Oh,
no, I just waiting on.
That's fine. I should.
My apologies, everybody. I'm going to try this again here. Open our eyes, Lord. We want to see Jesus, to reach out and touch him and say that we love him. Open our eyes, Lord, and help us to listen. Open our eyes, Lord. We want to see Jesus.
Let's pray. God, we are gathered this evening in the name of Jesus, who taught us what it is to be human, how to love you, and how to love our neighbor. During this season of Lent, open our eyes to all the ways in which you continue to be present with us. Let us learn from each other by sharing our stories, our questions, and our hopes. And all God's people said, Amen. The reading this evening comes from John, the 3rd chapter, beginning at the 14th verse. And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but may have eternal life. Indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order to say that the world might be saved through him. Those who believe in him are not condemned. Those who do not believe are condemned already because they have not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and the people love darkness rather than light, because their evil deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light and do not come to the light, so that their deeds may not be exposed. But those who do what is true come to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that their deeds have been done in God. Word of God, word of life. Thanks be to God.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we do have a special video from Daphne Corbett, who's a member of Trinity, a familiar voice and face for many of us. And she shares a little bit about what her experience was on a study abroad trip going to the Holy Land. If we have that video ready too.
Hello, this is Daphne Corbett. I'm happy to join you this Wednesday evening in Lent and reflect on the theme, We Wish to See Jesus. One of the ways I see and experience Jesus more fully in my mind and heart is by studying the ancient civilization he was a part of and understanding the languages he spoke. I have
We can't hear it, Peter.
Hello, this is Daphne Corbett. I'm happy to join you this Wednesday evening in Lent and reflect on the theme, We Wish to See Jesus. One of the ways I see and experience Jesus more fully in my mind and heart is by studying the ancient civilization he was a part of and understanding the languages he spoke. I have loved ancient cultures and spent a fair amount of time studying the Greek and Hebrew Bible when I was in college. In 1998, I was fortunate to go to the Holy Land as a part of a college study abroad experience, spending time in Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Egypt. I was fortunate to experience Lent, Passover, and Easter in the Holy Land. Inevitably, those experiences come to mind for me this time of year. Thinking of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus as actual historical events seems to be something rather important for how we conceive of ourselves as Christians. Lent and Advent are probably my favorite parts of the Christian year. I'm very happy to share this with you and dedicate some time to reflecting, considering, and studying the text for this week, John 3:14 through 21. I would like to share some of the ways I see Jesus in words and in art and even in stone. I love the Gospel of John. It starts out so strong and just keeps ticking right along. This week's passage is well known, but I'd forgotten, until I read it again, about Moses and the snake. Jesus says, "And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up." As a good teacher, Jesus is always referring back to other texts. It's hard not to want to connect all the dots right along with him. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. The word that stood out to me when reading this part was world. The word world has an interesting backstory and multiple meanings in the Greek. The Greek word for world is cosmos. Not only is it just more fun to say, it changes the connotation when you say it out loud. This is how God loved the cosmos. I learned that the word cosmos appears about 185 times in the New Testament, and over half of those times appears in the writings of John, 78 times in his gospel. It isn't used with uniform meaning throughout the New Testament. I learned that the first use of this Greek word goes all the way back to Homer, who refers to cosmos as the order. Also that Pythagoras and Plato used the word with some frequency but in different ways. In the fourth gospel, it seems like there are multiple meanings, but in this passage, many interpreters believe John is using it to refer to the world of humanity. I think we can read this meaning in verse 19 as well, when he said the light has come into the cosmos, and the people love darkness rather than the light. God loves the cosmos and gifts his Son to us, for the world of humanity, for a restoration. In my time in the Holy Land, I got to spend a day at the Sea of Galilee. It was a perfect spring day. I remember feeling restored and rejuvenated being there. Here's a picture of that day, with beautiful water and yellow flowers. I would like to see it under the stars someday. Apparently, Mark Twain did so, on horseback in 1867. He wrote, "In the starlight, Galilee has no boundaries, but the broad compass of the heavens."
All right. Thank you, Daphne. We're going to break out into, let's do a little love for her. And this is kind of the cool part of this Lenten Wednesday evening worship, where we get to break out into some rooms to have some conversation together. And I'll just post these questions really quick again. But what about tonight's story stood out to you? Have you experienced something like this in your own life? And where did you find hope in this story? Where did you find hope in this story? And so these will be here in the chat, and then you'll be whisked away. And if you'd accept that invitation to go to the breakout rooms conversation, and then we'll also come back together at the end for a prayer and a closing. See you in a few.
Hi. Hi, Rachel. We're in breakout rooms right now. Did a little message pop up for you to join room 6?
Oh yeah, I see that. Do you know how, I mean, I don't know.
You're
Does
welcome
it
to
make
stay
sense?
here. They'll probably be there for just about 1 more minute.
Yeah, I think I'll skip it just because to be like, hello, feels like a lot.
Totally understand that. I'm
Yeah.
just keeping an eye on my timer here.
Yes.
Yeah,
I get
they'll
it.
be about 1 more minute or so.
Cool. Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Wow, we were quick.
Quick to discuss or quick to get back?
Quick to get back. Zim, zoom, boom. We were right back. How you doing, Rachel? Good to
Pretty
see
good.
you.
Thank you. Yeah, nice to see you.
Now that we're back together, we'll close with a song and then a prayer.
I want Jesus to walk with me. I want Jesus to walk with me. All along my pilgrim journey, Lord, I want Jesus to walk with me.
Before we close in prayer, a reminder that we invite you all to stay on to hear from our guest speaker tonight. You can just stay on this Zoom link and you will be connected right to that experience. So we encourage you to stay. And thanks for being here. Let's pray. God of love, we give thanks for the courage of those who share their stories. Keep our eyes open for Jesus in our midst and strengthen us to be Jesus for others. As we move through our Lenten journey, calm our spirits and grant us your peace. We lift up all who are living in isolation, illness, or fear, all who are mourning and sitting vigil. Watch over scientists and healthcare providers as we move to a place of health and freedom from pandemic. Point us toward the light. And all God's children said, Amen. All right, we'll turn it back over to Pastor Peter.
All right. Thank you so much. We'll pivot into a time of learning together. And Rachel Nyward is here. And she's with the Mapping Prejudice Project. Let me just pull up my notes here really quick too. But she comes to us from St. Catherine University. She's been a part of this project around the lost stories of racism and housing, particularly in Ramsey County. And she and her students have discovered, through this archival project with the Mapping Prejudice project, which was started out of the University of Minnesota. So let's hand it over to you, Rachel. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here with you all. Let's see, I do have a PowerPoint because I'm a professor. And so is that okay? Okay. It's nice always to have things to look at. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and then I can share the PowerPoint, and then we'll get started. Let's see. Okay, can everybody see now good? Excellent. And, I always like to remind people, I have to remind my students of this every week, that once I'm sharing my screen, I can't really see the chat anymore. So it's okay to put questions and things in the chat, but you might have to also sort of unmute and holler at me so that I know that they're there. But
I can watch that too and make sure if anything comes through, just to be aware of it.
Perfect. Cool. So, and I'll try to stop periodically to provide some space for questions, but sometimes I get excited about what I'm talking about and I just sort of travel on. So we'll work together. So I have some stories and some information to share with you all. And then hopefully, there should be some time for questions and conversation at the end. So thank you again for inviting me. So I'm Rachel and I'm a history professor at St. Kate's. I like to provide a little background on me as I get started. So one thing to know about me is actually by training, my PhD is in modern British history. I study children. My dissertation is on children and education in the British Empire. And I do really like my work that I do as a British historian, and most of my teaching at St. Kate's, I teach European history. But I really wanted opportunities for students to be involved in my research. And it was hard to do that when I was working in British history projects because I can't take them to London to the British Library with me. So I was looking for a more local history project that I could be involved in. And as the collaboration between Mapping Prejudice and St. Kate's developed, there was room for me there. So I tell you that though, just so that you know that I'm still learning too, right? Because I don't think of myself first and foremost as an American historian. So we learn together tonight. So I hope that's okay. The other thing I like to say about myself as I get started is I think it's important to recognize my own positionality in relationship to my work, particularly in relationship to this work. So, I'm a white middle-class woman who lives in the suburbs, right? So I'm joining you this evening from Shoreview. That's where I live. My husband and I moved to the Twin Cities in 2004. When we moved to the cities, we bought our very first house together. And it was very exciting, as it always is when you're buying a house. And I remember thinking when we moved here and we were looking for that first house, that I understood that there were constraints around our home buying experience, but I also understood those constraints to be somewhat narrowly defined. Like the big constraint that I understood existed was like, how much house could we afford? Like I understood that as a very clear constraint. But it didn't really occur to me that there might be other constraints. And of course, it didn't really occur to me because as like white middle class folks trying to buy a house, there weren't a lot of other constraints, right? Beyond whatever constraints we wanted to create, right? Around what we could afford or, you know, where we wanted to live in relationship to where we worked in those kinds of, those kinds of issues. And of course, that's a real mark of sort of the privilege that I have as a white middle class woman, that I didn't have to think of my house buying adventure as having bigger constraints around it. And what I have learned, you know, as I've done this research is that for people of color in our community, of course, there are significant constraints today around buying homes, and that many of those constraints that exist today have historical roots. And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, are the historical roots. So the project that I work on at St. Kate's is called Welcoming the Dear Neighbor, with a question mark at the end. The question mark's really important to us. That phrase, welcoming the dear neighbor, comes from the Sisters of St. Joseph, who are the order of nuns who started St. Kate's. And this is part of their mission, is this idea that you welcome the dear neighbor without distinction, which is a really beautiful statement. And so in claiming this as the title of our project with the question mark at the end, we're really asking the question, right? In Ramsey County, did we welcome the dear neighbor? And I'll sort of tell you the endpoints of the story right now, which is that no, we did not welcome the dear neighbor. And I think we ought to, you know, want to think about that and sort of wrestle with that. And I don't think the story in Ramsey County is unique. So just some sort of broader context in the present about why I think the past matters. So, you know, typically Minneapolis and St. Paul rank highly as good places to live, right? If you look at, you know, any, you know, measure of different things, I mean, this is sort of a more formal kind of measure, right? This is from a US News and World Report ranking about the best place to live. This is from last year, and we'd actually fallen quite a bit, right? To number 22. The previous year, the Twin Cities were in the top 5 in this same survey. But, you know, there's all kinds of like strange sort of things posted on social media about, you know, the best place to live for young people, and the best place to live if you have children, and the best place to live if you have a dog. And, you know, the Twin Cities usually ranks highly. But the truth of the matter is that the Twin Cities is actually only the best place to live if you're white. Statistically speaking, one of the worst places to live in the entire United States if you're a person of color. And one of the ways we can look at that is in terms of homeownership. So the Twin Cities ranks first in terms of having the highest share of residents that own their own home, right? So that's a measure of prosperity. But if you look, if you cut that data by race, in fact, we have the largest racial disparity in homeownership in the Twin Cities. So in the Twin Cities, approximately 75% of white families own their own homes, and about 25% of Black families in the Twin Cities own their own homes. And that 50% difference puts us as the largest racial disparity in homeownership. And that's a really significant statistic, because homeownership and where you live actually touches all these other places in your life, right? Where you live often determines a host of other things. It determines your access to grocery stores with fresh fruits and vegetables. It determines your access to schools that you might determine or you might decide are good. It determines your access to green space. It determines your access to public transportation. And as has become particularly evident in the midst of this pandemic, where you live also says a lot about health. And right, where you live also has a significant impact on your sort of health outcomes for individuals. So that we have this disparity should make us feel nervous, or at least want to do something about it. Right? Because it suggests the depth of inequality and inequity in our community. And I would argue that the roots of this present disparity are in the past. And of course, I'm a historian, so I'm always interested to think about how the past impacts the present. And when I think about how this story, how these disparities set up historically, one of the starting places is really with the introduction of racial covenants in the Twin Cities in property deeds. And so in Hennepin County, the first racial covenant dates from 1910. Cleaning the data in Ramsey County. So for right now, the earliest racial covenant we found in Ramsey County comes from 1910, but it's possible there might be one a little earlier, though I think not likely. I think 1910 is probably where we're going to land for Ramsey County as well. And a racial covenant was simply language that was added to a housing deed that, or to a property deed that clearly identified who could and could not live in a particular property. And so the text that's here on the screen, this is actually the text of the first racial covenant that's found in Hennepin County. And I'm going to read the text of it out loud, though I do want to note before I read it, the language here is like pretty horrific, and it's not language that we would use today. So just know that. But, you know, with the Mapping Prejudice Project, we think it's important to sort of read these out loud and, you know, hear what got added to property deeds. So this is an example of a racial covenant. The party of the second part hereby agrees that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. And the rest of the sentence there says, said restrictions and covenants shall run with the land, and any breach or of any or either thereof shall work a forfeiture of title, which may be enforced by re-entry. So two really important things happen in the racial covenant. First, there's just this sort of blanket statement of who can and cannot live in this particular piece of property, okay? Right, so what the racial covenant does is it defines this as being a space for white people, that this particular property is only for white people. That second statement, though, that kind of sounds like legal gobbledygook, actually does really important work for the racial covenant, because it makes the racial covenant a particularly strong statement, because the racial covenant runs with the land, not with the owner of the property. So what that means is that these folks who bought this home in 1910, where this racial covenant comes from, if they say sold the house to someone in 1920 who thought, yeah, I'm not so keen on this, and so I'm just selling this house to whoever I want to. If that next owner sold the house to a person, to an African-American person, for example, the house would actually revert, the land would revert back to the original owners, because the covenant runs with the land, not the people. So legally speaking, these were incredibly strong ways to claim properties as for white people. Now, racial covenants, it's not as though the Twin Cities is the first place that they exist. We actually see them in the late 19th century, first in the West Coast. But by the early 20th century, there are pretty much racial covenants all across the United States, in all kinds of communities. So they're certainly not unusual. But what they do in the Twin Cities as they go into they come into effect here is they really do change the way that space is divided in our communities. And they also create a foundation on which a whole host of other processes can be built on. So racial covenants weren't secret. So here's another way that that in our community, we ensured that spaces would be white. Racial covenants aren't secret. They were actually considered ways to advertise for your particular community. They were considered, you know, ways that would help your development to sell. So this is an advertisement that ran in a St. Paul newspaper in the 19-teens. So this is a neighborhood around Como Park. So if you think about Como Park or the Como Park Zoo, So again, in a newspaper. And so the developer of this particular edition says, don't forget my restrictions, read them again. And again, I'm going to read the language as it exists in the historical document, but it's of course not language that we would use today. Fourth, that grantee cannot sell or lease said real estate to a colored person. You have my assurance that the above restrictions will be enforced to the fullest extent of the law. So racial covenants aren't secret. They're selling features for particular properties, right? That helps to ensure, again, that spaces stay or claim some spaces as white spaces and other spaces as something else. They also then lay the groundwork for the redlining that happens in the 1930s. And I think you all read Rothstein's Color of Law, right? So, you know, you hate to think of redlining as being successful. Like, I feel like that's not the right term, because it really does rot such horrific work in communities. But redlining is able to happen in the 1930s because racial covenants in the Twin Cities had already drawn the map to look like this. So these are the HOLC maps for Minneapolis and St. Paul from about 1937. I'll show you in a few minutes the mapping prejudice map of Hennepin County, where they show all the presence of all the different racial covenants. And, you know, if we could lay that racial covenant map on top of the Minneapolis HOLC map, what you would find is that the neighborhoods that have race, that are blanketed in racial covenants, those are the blue and green neighborhoods. Those were the desirable neighborhoods. The neighborhoods that don't have racial covenants are those red and yellow neighborhoods. So, you know, for me as a historian, when I think about the story that Rothstein tells in The Color of Law, which is like his work that he's done to sort of pull this story together, is quite impressive and quite remarkable. But I do think there's a history that comes before it, right, that creates the possibility for the story that he tells to work. And it's this story of racial covenants. And so the Mapping Prejudice Project, which is housed at the U of M, the work that they're doing is to build a map showing the presence of racial covenants in a particular place. And so they started in Hennepin County. And their work is really so remarkable. I can't say enough about the Mapping Prejudice Project. I mean, historians had certainly known about racial covenants. You could find lots of historical works that talk about racial covenants. But what we didn't know, and what historians didn't have a way to understand, is sort of what they look like spread across an entire community, right? Because if you can map how they're spread across an entire community, then you can start to map other kinds of data on top of that. But the only way to do this would have been to like sit in a property, in the property, like the county property office, and like go through deeds one at a time. It would take forever. It would be an impossible task. But what Mapping Prejudice developed is this remarkable process using something called OCR, which is optical character recognition. So they take digitized property deeds, they get run through this OCR program, and OCR flags deeds that have potential racial language. And then community members, okay, look through the deeds that are flagged to see if there's actual racial language. So if you think about, for example, as the project's been happening in Ramsey County, right, White Bear Lake is a part of Ramsey County, and so that flags as potential racial language, even though in that case it's not. And at the end, what you can see then, once sort of all of the Mapping Prejudice work happens, is you can have a map that literally maps all the places where these racial covenants were. And then you can start to ask different questions, right, about how space is constructed and how space has been imagined, which is really incredible. So Mapping Prejudice finished their work in Hennepin County, I think a couple years ago at this point. And then St. Kate's partnered with Mapping Prejudice to bring the project to Ramsey County. was a little bit complicated because the start of their project is, of course, that you have to have digitized property deeds. And in Ramsey County, the property deeds were not digitized. So that was sort of a complicated starting point. So we worked with the county and negotiated with the county so that they would agree to have their deeds digitized and then turn them over to the Mapping Prejudice project. The first deeds went live on the Mapping Prejudice website a little over a year ago, like last February. But the remarkable thing, remarkable and tragic thing that happened is we had imagined this as a 3-year project because that's about how long Hennepin County took. But then the pandemic happened and lots of people were at home looking for things to do. And this was a project you could do at home online. And then George Floyd was murdered. And there was a lot of discussion about the presence of systemic racism in our communities. And so suddenly Mapping Prejudice was inundated with volunteers. And so work that we thought was going to take 3 years was completed in the 3rd week of February, in just about, almost 12 months to the day of getting started. And so the Ramsey County map isn't complete yet because there's a fair amount of like back end work that has to happen to clean the data before you can actually build the map. And because of the pace, it just hasn't been possible to keep up. But the Ramsey County, the actual map should be available in the next 6 months or so. And I do have a sneak peek that I'll show you later this evening. But the actual work of searching the deeds in Ramsey County has been completed. The hope is to now turn our attention to the counties surrounding the metro area so that we can have a much wider scale picture. The work that I've been doing, in addition to helping to help community members to know how to do the work with Mapping Prejudice, is really in the archives to sort of understand what are the stories that create the map, right? Because the map is one way of understanding and seeing what happens. But of course, there are people, real people who lived and experienced things. And this is what I'm interested in learning about. And it's been challenging. My general sense in Ramsey County is that, particularly I think for white people in Ramsey County, we don't like to talk about racism in our community. We like to pretend that it doesn't exist. And so what we do is we don't tell stories about racism and housing inequality in our community, except in Ramsey County. You do hear people talk about the story with the Rondo neighborhood, which is a really important story. I don't want to suggest that it's not an important story. But I think what ends up happening is that we sort of draw a box around the story of the Rondo neighborhood and we say there was racism there, but not any place else, just in this one little box. And then we think about what happens to the Rondo neighborhood as being an anomaly. My research suggests that it's not an anomaly, that in fact what happens in the Rondo neighborhood is the culmination of decades of racist housing policies and racist actions around housing in Ramsey County. And so I have 2 stories I'm going to share with you this evening that I've discovered in my research. And the research is a little challenging because I think we like to identify sort of Rondo as being the story, and we sometimes make it the only story. It means that these other stories are lost, right? Because usually the way I would do my work as a historian is that I'd have some sort of idea in my head of here are people or events that I want to know more about. But in this particular case, I don't know what the people or events are. I can't find other books that have been written that tell me what the other people or events are. So my method before the pandemic was that with my students, I would go to the Minnesota Historical Society and we would all take a roll of microfilm and we were literally going through newspapers one day at a time. we started in 1924 because I did know about one story, which I'm going to tell you about here in a minute. But really what I'm looking to do is start in 1900 and go through about 1968, again, just page by page through the newspapers, so that I can build a timeline and understand the who and the what, so that then I can start looking in the archives for more particular information. So my stories are admittedly a little bit fragmentary tonight too, because I only have them in bits, but they're still interesting stories nonetheless. So my first story comes from the year 1909. And in May of 1909, Dr. Bell, who was an African-American dentist in St. Paul, rented an apartment that he owned at 88 Lincoln Avenue. So this is it. This brick building is it. It still stands today. This particular property is in the Crocus Hill neighborhood. So if you're familiar with St. Paul, the Crocus Hill neighborhood is that sort of neighborhood, you know, between like Grand and Summit, with the big fancy houses and the big wide streets and the nice sidewalks and big trees, right? So Dr. Bell rents an apartment in May of 1909 to a woman named Mrs. Jackson. She was an African-American woman. And the newspaper accounts that I found of this particular story are a little bit inconsistent in how they describe Mrs. Jackson. Some of the newspaper articles say that she moved in with her husband. Other articles say that she moves in and she's like widowed when she moves in. So it's not entirely clear who's there, but it's always identified as being a woman who's moved into the apartment. Well, she was the first African-American woman to move into the Crocus Hill neighborhood, and her white neighbors were not happy about it. And this particular story is covered not just in newspapers here in the Twin Cities, it's covered in newspapers across Minnesota, and it's actually covered nationally. The first references that I found to this story actually come from an African-American newspaper that was published in New York City. So this was not like an inconsequential story at the time, right? It got attention. In these newspaper articles, the white neighbors in Crocus Hill are referred to as the wealthy people of St. Paul, the society members, the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, right? There's every suggestion that these are very respectable folk. And so what do they decide to do when Mrs. Jackson moves in? Well, they decided to have a meeting, and they call it an indignation meeting, which I think is a delightful title, and also, you know, a little horrifying. This was kind of a 19th century thing. Like, you'd have a meeting to talk about, you know, the thing that made you really mad in your community. And so they hosted these indignation meetings, these white neighbors to try to figure out what to do. And their solutions included violence and harassment. So they broke windows in Mrs. Bell's apartment. They rang the doorbells at all hours of the day to try to bother her. And some of the newspaper articles report that at these indignation meetings, there was actually talk of lynching as the solution to the problem. That perhaps what we should do, because Mrs. Jackson has moved in, is simply to lynch her, and that will solve the problem. And the articles, the quote at the top of the page here, near race riot in St. Louis City, I mean, this is how this is described. This event is described. It's described as being almost a race riot. But my guess is that for many of you, and certainly for me until I discovered these stories, this is a new story. This is perhaps an unfamiliar story. You know, for me as a historian, the question that it raises is, you know, what does it mean if we don't tell this story as part of our history? What does it mean that we've let this story become lost? I also think there's sort of a narrative, a historical narrative that develops. So in 1909, when this is happening in Crocus Hill, this is also the same moment, if you've watched Jim Crow of the North, that really features stories from Hennepin County. In 1909 is when they tell the story of the Jackson family, who was the first African-American family to move into Prospect Park. And much the similar sort of thing happens when they move into that, when the Jackson family moves into that neighborhood. And so, right, we can see between Minneapolis and St. Paul in 1909 that, right, space is changing. Space is becoming more integrated. And suddenly the white neighbors are sort of in a flit to figure out what to do about it. And so it's not a surprise that then when we get to 1910, then we start to see racial covenants, which are like an organized, clear, legal way to say, this is a white neighborhood, don't live here, right? You can't live here if you're a person of color. So there's this sort of script that's starting to develop. But that brings me to my second story. And I think about my second story, it's often told as the William and Nellie Francis story, but I always tell it as the Nellie Francis story. And I have to be honest, I think of it as her story. I think that, Bill Green, who's a historian at Augsburg, has just written a really remarkable biography of Nellie Francis. And she is this fascinating woman. And I think she doesn't always get her due. So I'm going to give her her due and call this her story. So Nellie Francis was a prominent African-American suffrage leader in St. Paul. Her family's from Tennessee. They actually moved to St. Paul in the late 19th century because in the aftermath of the Civil War, they were concerned that Tennessee was becoming, in fact, too racist and not a good place to raise their children. Nellie has a sister. And so they hear that St. Paul is perhaps a better place to be, and they move here. Nellie Francis graduates from Central High School in St. Paul. She's the only Black student in her graduating class. At her graduation, there was a speech contest where the students in her class all gave speeches. And the newspapers in St. Paul covered the speech contest. And so Nellie Francis is this, 17 or 18-year-old. Again, she's the only Black graduate in her class. Stands up and gives a speech called The Problem of Race, and really calls out the community for its treatment of African American people. By all accounts, according to the newspaper stories, even the white newspapers, her speech is the best one, but she does not win the speech contest. But it always seems remarkable to me, right? It's a good reminder that even at 17 or 18, this sort of possibility in the way that you can influence your community is not limited, right? She is well connected in the community. She's well connected nationally. During the suffrage movement, she leads the African American women's suffrage groups in St. Paul. She's the author of the anti-lynching legislation that passes through the Minnesota legislature in the early 1920s. She's an utterly remarkable woman who is unfamiliar to a lot of people, right? She's another one of these stories that gets lost. But in 1924, she and her husband purchased a house at 2092 Sargent Avenue in St. Paul. That house also still stands. It's the house in the picture there. They are the first, Nellie and her husband are the first African-American family to move into the Mac Groveland neighborhood. And just like the story we saw in Crocus Hill, the white neighbors there are not happy. And so what do they decide to do? The newspaper articles don't talk about them having indignation meetings, but they do seem to have a 1920s version of an indignation meeting. First, they try to negotiate with the Francises and buy them out of their house. That's their first effort. When they're not successful at that, they also then engage in acts of violence to try to push Nellie and her husband out of the neighborhood. Nellie and William Francis have to hire private security to keep themselves safe in their home for the 2 years that they lived there. The house was pretty regularly surrounded by mobs of people. And in fact, twice in late 1924 and early 1925, a cross is burnt in their front yard. And if I'm not being a very critical thinker, it's easy for me to imagine that cross burning is something that happens somewhere else, right? Like I put that in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, right? If I'm not thinking hard. But in fact, the history of St. Paul is that cross burning happened an 8-minute walk from my office at St. Kate's, because that's where her house is. I can walk there on my lunch break, you know, when it's not a pandemic and I get to go back to my office again. That's where cross burning happened. Not just in Mississippi, not just in Alabama, by my office. But again, I wonder, is that the history we tell of where we live? The other thing that's interesting in this particular story, so the quote on the top of this page, this actually comes from a letter that Nellie Francis writes, describing what's been happening at their house. You know, we have been having some time. And, you know, I think about that, like we have been having some time. We've been having some time because they've been burning crosses in our yard. We've been having some time because they're throwing rocks through our window. We've been having some time because people with guns are surrounding our home. You know, that's what they're having. But I'm interested not just in the ways that we don't tell this story, but even at the time how the story gets told. So this little clip here, this story was actually pretty widely reported in St. Paul newspapers. And you'll note in the little clip here, this is pretty representative of how the story is told. Nellie doesn't get mentioned at all. She gets entirely erased from the story, right? She's not there. It's just him. And so for me, that makes me think, you know, two things. Let me skip ahead and we'll come back to that. You know, what stories do we tell and who is the actor in those stories, right? So I guess I would argue if we want to think seriously and deal seriously with racial disparities around home ownership in our community today. And I realize that, you know, Stillwater, you are not in Ramsey County, so this is not necessarily, you know, your community right in St. Paul. But my guess is if I dove into the archives of Stillwater, I can't say that I would be shocked to find that there as well, there was a lot of effort made in the 20th century to define spaces in Stillwater as white spaces, right? And for white people. But if we want to take seriously and do something about the significant racial disparities that exist in our community, I think we have to think about the stories that we tell, and we have to be willing to own our history. We have to be willing to think about a history that's broader than just the Rondo neighborhood, that doesn't just put a box. And again, not to say that what happened in Rondo wasn't horrific. It is, but that's not the only story, right? I also think we have to think about who's the actor in the stories that we tell. You know, it strikes me in the stories about Mrs. Jackson that the reason that she is named in those stories is because she is a woman who in 1909 seems to be living in a different kind of situation than what was expected of most women. And so that's why she gets mentioned, because I think part of what the newspapers want to say is, well, if you're a single woman living by yourself, why would you expect anything else, right? It's a way to see the intersection of her race and her gender, right? Nellie just gets erased. We don't even think about her. So, right, to me, that also makes me think, how do we talk about in the present about the unique ways that these disparities in housing impact women, right? And then, of course, it raises this question of how do we overturn systems? Because this doesn't, you know, spaces in the Twin Cities aren't defined as white spaces because individuals sat by themselves in their house and decided this would be a white space. We created systems to make things white spaces, right? Developers, built racial covenants into land that they were developing. Realtors had a code of conduct that said they shouldn't, it was unethical to integrate neighborhoods in the early part of the 20th century, right? Redlining is a system to define, who gets to live where, right? That ends up being the impact of it. They're all systems. And so if we want to solve the problem of housing disparity today, we are not going to solve the problem just by changing people's minds individually. We have to overturn the systems. And the other way you can see the systems, this will be my my last thing over there. Just here's a sort of preview of the map. So mapping prejudice, this is what the map looks like that they create. So all the red represents racial covenants. So of course you can see Hennepin County there around Minneapolis, right? And on the other side of the Mississippi River. So that part of the map is complete, okay? What you see of Ramsey County, this was the work that had been done on the map up through October in terms of the back end cleaning of the map. So this is not a complete version of the Ramsey County map. But it is a start. It's sort of a preview of what the map will look like. So, the map, because it's a map of Ramsey County, it does not cover you all in Stillwater, but you can see sort of out in those suburbs, sort of on the way to Stillwater, right? You can see the presence of racial covenants there, right? Impacting the creation of what those neighborhood spaces look like. So that's sort of the end of what I have to share or show you, but I'm happy to answer questions. I hope this has been interesting and fit with your series. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions or comments or.
No, thank you, Rachel. Let's give a little bit some love. Appreciate, yeah. And I think the intersection of stories really fits with a lot of the work that we've been doing too, that these things have narratives, that it's not just that policies are even a narrative arc of people's experiences and stories, and the intersectionality of those agreements and covenants and how they're impacted so many neighborhoods and communities, and particularly our neighbors of color. But let's lift it up, just questions that folks have. And yeah, Claudia, it looks like you're ready.
So you mentioned, Rachel, and thank you very much, that this is going to try to expand now to Washington and Scott and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about the timeline and sort of what the impetus is for that expansion?
So one of the reasons why it's going to expand is because we think if we really want to holistically understand the experience in the Twin Cities, we have to think about the neighboring counties, right? Because in fact, as the cities grow and expand over the 20th century, a lot of people live outside the cities and come into the cities to work. And so this is a way to sort of tell a more holistic story. I believe the next place that the work is going to go, Mapping Prejudice is just finishing, I think, negotiations for deeds from Anoka County and I think Dakota County is next. The two are next. The tricky thing is that deeds have to be digitized as a starting point. And so I know in Anoka County, the deeds are already digitized. So I think that will bring it next. But a really exciting thing that has happened in the last 6 months is that the Mapping Prejudice Project has been awarded a really significant grant by the National Endowment for the Humanities, which will allow them to bring their research methodology to communities across the United States, because they really do. The method they have developed is so unique. No one else really has offered anything else. And so their hope is to make this available to other communities to be able to do the work. So right now, if you were to go to the Mapping Prejudice website and look at the, you wanted to do the deed transcription work, I believe there's a set of deeds from Washington, D.C. that are up on their website right now that you can work on. So let's see, I saw the question on the chat. Are any racial covenants still in existence in the Twin Cities? So yes and no. Racial covenants are ruled unenforceable by the Supreme Court in the late 40s. Oh my goodness, the name of the case has just flown out of my head. I will think about it for a moment and it'll like filter back to me. But there is a Supreme Court case in the late 40s that named racial covenants unenforceable. It though takes a while from that Supreme Court decision for it to actually sort of live in reality in communities. So in Ramsey County, we still see racial covenants being added to properties in 1960. Some 20 years after the Supreme Court has said racial covenants are unenforceable. I would say by the time you get to 1968 with the passage of the Fair Housing Act as part of the Civil Rights Act, that, racial covenants are sort of done at that point. But two things are important to remember. Racial covenants, first of all, don't go away. So in the Twin Cities, for example, if your home had a racial covenant, because the racial covenant runs with the land, yes, thank you, Shelley v. Kramer in 1948. I had Plessy versus Ferguson in my head, but that is entirely the wrong case and from the wrong century. So just wrong all around. So because racial covenants run with the land, technically they're still part of property deeds today. They're just not enforceable. And I would argue as a historian, we don't want to delete those, because if we delete them and erase them, we can forget that they ever existed. There is a process that the Minnesota legislature passed into law where you can discharge a racial covenant if there is a racial covenant on your property deed. There's definitely issues in that process because it costs money. So that, sort of limits who has access to it. But essentially what you do when you discharge a racial covenant is you add language to your property deed that says, I disagree with this. I don't support this. But, there's also a trickier part, I think, of your question, Kim. Are there any racial covenants still in existence? One of the really sad and horrifying things that I've come to realize as I've done this work is that, racism is so nimble, and nimble in really horrific ways. So that, when racial covenants become not a legal way to sort of define spaces as white spaces, we just find other ways to do it, right? We create mortgage laws, right? Or sort of mortgage practices that limit who can get mortgages to buy houses where, right? We create processes around how homes are appraised that, right, benefit white people and don't benefit people of color. Because racial covenants existed earlier in the 20th century, one of the things that also happens is that, of course, there's a way, right? Homes are often the way that families build wealth. And because people don't have a meat, right? If, African-American families didn't have the opportunity to buy homes earlier in the century, their families aren't building wealth at quite the same rate. And then they're not able, right, to buy homes later. We seem to just find new ways to claim spaces as white. And, I would argue that's because we swim in a sea of white supremacy. And if we want to be different, we have to be different. For me, it puts me in a sort of final place where I can't help but think that there's a certain justice to the idea of reparations. And I know that, not everybody agrees with reparations, but I'm not sure, how to right these wrongs of history that have such lingering lingering impacts right into the future. I mean, even when, like, I didn't realize this at the time, you know, we were in our, like, it's not like we were so young, but I don't know, we were in our late 20s or early 30s when we moved here to the Twin Cities. And, you know, we didn't live here. This isn't, so we went online, you know, we found a realtor, and the realtor said, go online and look for houses and then send me a list. And so we did that. We were very excited. We sent her a list, and she called us up and she said, I'll show you those houses if you insist, but I think you should look some more. And I don't know, like, we were 28 and had never bought a house and thought, oh, well, okay, I guess we'll go look some more. You know, now what I've realized is that that initial list of houses that we sent her, they were all in North Minneapolis. And, you know, what she was saying was a sort of different kind of way to get to a racialized thinking about who lives where. It's just that we didn't realize it, which is certainly not an excuse, but it's what happened.
Yeah, I think you touched on that beautifully about, you know, racism being so nimble, and Rothstein talks about that in his book too, how, you know, maybe it was these neighborhoods will be demolished and then, you know, different federal housing will be put up, or maybe it's, you know, mortgage practices. We're not going to insure homes for Black folks, but we will for white folks, and all of these things. And so I was wondering what kind of language you could teach us about that exists today that's coded around race. Like you mentioned mortgage practices and appraisals, but, you know, what would be red flags as we hear? Is it about like sizing of housing or government subsidized housing, or what would we, you know, and again, I think those questions that you bring up of who's, you know, whose stories are we telling, who's the actor, and whose perspective is it from, whose stories are we not telling? That's a question I ask, you know, my students a lot. I'm a middle school teacher, and so, you know, who's getting the airtime here, who's left out? Oh, they're really important questions. So yeah, what do you know about that? I'd love to learn more.
Oh, I mean, I think one of the ways we do it today, and I mean, this happened historically too, is with like discussions around zoning, right? Like whether space is zoned for single family homes or multi-family dwellings, right? Like that is, I think, often coded language around race, given like the statistics of who lives in a single family home in our communities. So I think that's one of the ways it gets talked about. I think about too, sometimes language that we use, because I think particularly for families buying homes, right, the discussion about like schools is a really important one. And there's always that discussion of like, is this in the good school district? And I mean, I actually think that's often coded language about race. So, I mean, those are the sort of immediate things that, or, you know, even I think discussions about affordable housing, particularly as that relates to thinking about, you know, like housing that's subsidized for like lower income families. I think that's often coded language around race too. You know, again, it's really built into our historical DNA in the United States to figure out which are the white spaces and which are not. And we still keep looking for ways to do that, sadly. I see Gail's question about the mapping is to document history. Are there other ways the maps are used? Next steps. So there are. So I know in Hennepin County, now I'm not going to remember the name. They've just come out with their sort of city they have sort of a new like housing plan for the city. It's the 60-40 plan or the 80-20 plan. There's like some percentage there that adds up to 100. And they actually use the mapping prejudice map data from Hennepin County as one of their data points to help develop that particular plan. There's also a lot of interesting work that can be done once the map is created to sort of map other bits of information on top of it. So in the fall at St. Kate's, we had a data visualization class where they started with the mapping prejudice maps from Hennepin County. And then the students worked in groups and sort of mapped other data on top of it. So one group looked at, for example, police violence and sort of reports of police violence and how did that map against the mapping prejudice data. Another group looked at air quality data and mapped that against the mapping prejudice Hennepin County map. And it's really interesting, actually, the results that they discovered just in this sort of preliminary work. Because again, it turns out where you live relates to a lot of other things as well. So John, I see, has added a question. Do you have any comments on racial profiling in policing in the Twin Cities? And that's a really good question. And I'll preface my answer by telling my students the thing that I tell them often, which is that you're of course always welcome to disagree with me and it does not hurt my feelings. I will be okay. But I mean, I would say not just here in the Twin Cities, but I would say nationally, we have a significant issue with regards to policing and racial profiling and the treatment of people of color in our criminal justice systems. Those strike me as, you know, just like I want to think about the sort of systemic nature of racism with regards to housing. I think those same systems, or not those same systems, but I think equally there are systems that are impacting the criminal justice system that also need to be dealt with. You know, it's, you know, sometimes people say to me when I talk about housing, well, isn't it just the case that like white people just want to live with white people and Black people want to live with Black people? And, you know, I don't actually think that's the case. That's not how that historically worked out. It worked out because we created systems to enforce it that way. And, you know, I've sometimes had students ask me, for example, when we've talked about criminal justice, well, you know, when you look at the statistics, for example, of the number of people of color that are currently incarcerated, there are far more people of color incarcerated than there are, you know, white people incarcerated. And I've had students say to me, well, doesn't that just mean that more people of color are committing crimes? And no, I don't think that's what that means. I think what it means is that the criminal justice system treats people of color differently, such that the end result is that they end up in prison rather than not. Were many, oh, go ahead.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's see. So Charlie asks, were many of these covenant changes in existing neighborhoods, do you find their timing aligned with the Great Migration of the early 20th century? So the first way that we see covenants, at least in the Twin Cities, is mostly attached to developers who have, so more what we, well, okay, let me start over because now that was all muddled. In the Twin Cities, in the early 20th century, what we start to see happen is that developers are buying up large patches of land that had previously been farmland, right? And so developers are buying it up and building then communities, right? Different developments and neighborhoods. And that's how racial covenants start for the most part. It's not like individuals who sort of wake up one day and think like, I'm going to add this language to my property. It's like an entire neighborhood gets blanketed at the moment that it's built. We will see in the 30s, by the time you get to like redlining, the same sort of thing is happening with developers, because builders who needed loans from the federal government, right? And this is part of the story that Rothstein tells, right? Builders who need loans from the federal government to build often have to agree that the homes that they are building won't be sold to African American people. So, you know, I think it's sort of, in terms of how it aligns with the Great Migration, it sort of ebbs and flows. I mean, I think more what happens is, I mean, I wouldn't want to suggest that like in the 19th century, St. Paul is an integrated city, because I think that's a challenging concept, right? Because even like, I mean, frankly, plantations are integrated spaces, but that's not what we mean when we talk about integration, right? When we talk about a space being integrated. So I don't want to suggest that in the 19th century that, you know, St. Paul was an integrated city and everybody liked each other, right? I don't think that's how that happened. I think what happens though in the early 20th century is that we see neighborhoods, like white people start to become scared the composition of their neighborhood is going to change. And so then there starts to be a lot of fear and focus on how do we ensure that the neighborhood's only for white people? And that's when it starts to change.
Well, thank you for being a truth teller and for digging into this really hard history for us, and I think ongoing work that that we'll be a part of for Washington County as well, and the way in which all of these pieces are interconnected. But thank you for telling stories too that I think really need to be heard. So
Well,
thank you, Rachel.
thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to come and talk to people, and it's always exciting that people are interested. So,
And if there is, so just if there's any way that folks want to continue to help and support, just head to the Mapping Prejudice Project or to the St. Kate's division of welcoming the dear neighbor, right? Question mark. Yeah, what a great name, and I think really fits with a lot of our mission and values too at Trinity, and how we love God and love our neighbors moving forward. So thank you so much.
you're so welcome. Thank you again for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. And if you'd like to stick around, we've got a book discussion. We're going to go deeper now into Rothstein's book, and really, I think, so many examples that that Rachel highlighted and that are part of this conversation. So if you're a part of this group, you can stay. If not, have a wonderful night. Good night, everybody.
I'm going to say goodbye because I think my husband and children are waiting for me to have dinner. So I feel like they will be sad if I make them wait longer.
No, please go have dinner.
All right.
Enjoy. All right. Take care.
You.
Good night. Hello.
Hi there.
Hello.
Sweet. So she's just an extra screen, but we can.
I'll be back.
Yeah, no worries. We can take just a breather as we transition from this is now the third Zoom.
Tell me what I missed. Who was the speaker? I couldn't make it at 6:30. Who was the speaker tonight at worship?
Was it Tom? Do you know who it was, Tom?
I don't recall. Sorry. It
was your wife. It was Daphne.
Oh, Daphne.
Oh, I missed Daphne. Oh.
She did the video message, and then it was someone from the university. Is that right? Who studied?
The Lent speaker was Daphne, and then just after, and we had this woman from St. Kate's come and talk too.
St. Kate's.
Yeah, from the Mapping Prejudice Project, which was really good. Dang, and really messed up. Gosh, it's like,
it's a good word.
Talk about righteous indignation meetings. And that, the reverse of that is terrifying too. Indignation meetings. Yeah. Ugh. Well, thanks for digging in and for joining us. Matt Simsick is here with us. I have no idea how you did not get joined into the original group, but these systems.
Well, that's okay. I told Deb I was gonna do it because I bought the book last summer.
Yeah.
I was so excited. I'd seen him a little video with him with Rothstein, and then I completely forgot last week. And Deb asked me about it, and I went, "Wait a minute, I think we started last week."
Well, it's all good. And so we talked a little bit about getting through some of the considering fixes. Is that kind of where we're at? Is that where we want to dwell tonight for a little while?
I confess I didn't get any reading done this week.
Okay. That's okay.
You were a bit busy, I bet.
I'm sure you were doing much good work otherwise.
Busy and concerned about my dad, who's doing a little better right now, but yeah.
I also do recommend the Bill Green's book that you mentioned about Nellie Francis.
Yeah, I hadn't
Impactful story.
Really, yeah. Yes.
Actually,
go ahead, Penny.
if you wanna hear Bill Green talk about race, the St. Croix Valley Conversations of the Valley, he was one of their guest speakers 2 months ago.
January 20th.
Yeah, and they have the video on there of the meeting, as well as they have discussion questions.
Guys.
So yeah, he was a fascinating person to listen to, and he mentioned her. And I'm like, who is this?
Yeah.
Like, oh, okay.
I think that's one of the that's one of the fixes that Rothstein. It's a great segue, Penny and Sarah. Well done. Like you just slip that right in there.
We'll be expecting our checks later.
They're always in the mail. I don't know if they get to you, but I think just that the whole idea of education, if we want to talk about kind of, what were you taught about this growing up? Do you have any recollection of the kind of tentacles of racism in different parts of your life, in school and home life? What are your reflections on that?
That's a loaded question.
I was gonna say where I grew up, I don't know if I saw a Black person in the area I grew up.
Mhm.
When we went to Milwaukee,
Sure.
we would, but not where I lived. But they talked about Native Americans
Mm-hmm.
very poorly.
You're in your family, or
Mhm.
do they?
Yeah. In the family, they were lazy drunks,
Yeah.
was the description that was used frequently.
Mhm.
They were not motivated people. You
Mhm.
couldn't get them to do anything. Yeah, that was the statement.
What about just in like education? I think that's one of the things he, in history books, did you encounter stories of Black resistance, of Black people in positive nuance?
Not much history either. There was slavery and then they were freed. That was kind of like it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't even think we ever even got the de facto segregation.
Yeah.
No.
And I grew up in a town, Dearborn, Michigan, hometown of Henry Ford, which he speaks about in one of the first chapters.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, we had a mayor for 30 years that wouldn't allow Black people to move to town. And in fact, the house that sold right behind me, and I think I was really little, so probably 73, 74, it had in the purchase agreement of the Netkowskis who moved in, who bought it for Mrs. Tabak, it said, you will not sell this house to.
So that's part of that. Yeah.
Which was at least 6 years after it was illegal.
Right. Yeah. The racial covenant piece that, it still is there even but definitely. Yeah. Where is that? So where is that, like near Detroit? How far is that?
It borders Detroit.
Yeah. So it's a kind of an exurb or just
Yep.
inner ring. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess now it would be called inner ring,
And so that would have been a red, that would have been, well, on her map, I guess it would have been red, but it would have been blue on it's like blue on the redlining maps, right? That had these.
Correct. Yep.
You know,
Yeah, and even within Detroit, there were, he mentioned it a little bit, but even within Detroit, there were areas that were
particular neighborhoods
worse than others. Yeah. And right with the industry and the polluters.
Yeah.
I grew up in a small town in Kansas, and I had one black classmate and another one who at least one, there have to be at least 2 or 3 that had Native American blood, but you know, we didn't talk about that, but I remember my girlfriend saying that she was treated poorly because of her Native American status. But I didn't ever actually see it, that I registered it. And we talked about the guy who had some in his heritage. He always had the legs for the powder puff game, the legs contest, because he didn't have hair on his legs. You know, it was just one of those things that you always knew which ones were Tim's legs, you know, in the picture, because they weren't hairy. But we knew which small communities around us had more Italians in them. And I'm talking about, my hometown was 3,500, and these other little communities around but we all mixed together. We were all in one school district. There wasn't anything, you know, better education in one part of town or another. We had 3 elementary schools in town and 3 country schools around that kids went to. And then by junior high, we were all together. And it was just distance, not any good side or bad side of town.
Anything that you recall about the curriculum or what you learned in school about the history of race? Like Martin Luther.
No, I don't remember a whole lot about that, but we were close to, I grew up in the area where George Washington Carver did a lot of his work. So that was a field trip for us, and he was respected, and we studied it.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, and when I've heard adults recently, I heard someone, you know, I never did figure out why he said it, but he would describe his town as being near the Mason-Dixon line. And I thought, well, that's a really kind of a weird thing. And after he said it a couple of times, I kind of asked him what he meant by it, but he kind of just dodged off to the side. And I said, well, I grew up 12 miles from the Mason-Dixon line myself. I grew up just into Kansas. And I remember learning about Quantrell's raiders coming across and the fight over whether Kansas was to be a slave state or not. So I obviously remember some of that from elementary history.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Something that struck me that Rachel was talking about today with that statement that it's in our DNA. And I was glancing this morning at the New York Times had a column of student essays from the Common App, the essays they would put on their college entrance exam or entrance applications. And they just had just a few excerpts. And this one Spanish with some native blood, indigenous blood, she was saying that she came home from 3rd grade and was devastated that everyone was invited to the party except her because of her skin color. And her mother said, well, that little girl's mother I went to school with, and she also bullied me. So I just keep thinking that, you know, as much as we want to overturn the system and all those things, boy, we've got a lot of work to do. That was just heartbreaking.
And just that prejudice and that gets passed down in
The
family.
DNA, the trauma, yeah.
And
the trauma that the others are feeling because it's in our DNA. And
the adopted daughter that I have was not invited to a birthday party at about that third grade kind of a stage. And she's reminded me recently that I told her that she should go ahead and get a birthday present for her. And the girl opened it up and gave it back to Jeanette and said she didn't want it.
Oh man.
Oh,
It's devastating. Yeah.
And see, having grown up where I grew up, I had said something to a friend of mine. It's actually her husband, who's Hispanic, and I said, well, I think with every generation it gets better and better and better. And he said, man, you have to understand that as soon as the economy goes down or goes into the tank, people blame other people who don't look like them.
Yeah.
And it all starts over again.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to believe it. This was the mid 90s. I didn't want to believe it. And I believe it now.
There's a line in the letter from a Birmingham jail about that, like the getting lulled into this notion that just the passage of time creates progress, and how it's a fool's belief, you know. And
Privilege
I think
place.
about that a lot, because like, I grew up in the 80s and 90s and stuff, and like a lot of, I think the reading between the lines, like, this is all figured out. We figured all this out in the 60s and 70s. You know, we repealed all the Jim Crow laws, and you know, everybody has an equal shot at everything. And you know, we don't need to do anything. Don't worry about it. Just go off and do your thing. And then, you know, 30 years go by and you realize that the kids who are 15 and 20 years old right now, they have it figured out. Like, if you're not actually actively trying to change things, things don't change. Like, there's way too much incentive for things not to change or things to backslide.
That's been one of the
that's
been one of the biggest educations for me since last spring, is that, you know, reading, you know, the new Jim Crow law, and reading How to Be an Anti-Racist, and all these things in this book, understanding that color blindness doesn't cut it, right? And this one especially, I was starting to lead towards it, and then when I saw Rothstein's video I watched, realizing that that it's generational. When you're allowed to buy a home for very inexpensive, and then you build up all that equity, now you sell that, that's a whole leg up that a segment of the population wasn't allowed to have.
Right.
And so it's not that, okay, slavery ended, okay, Jim Crow ended, okay, segregation is over. It's that it doesn't just stop.
Well, and I think what you're pointing to too, Tom, is the idea, and I think in kind of the 80s and 90s of kind of the economic booms of those times too, that people wanted to kind of push that under the rug and just kind of be lulled for a while. But then, you know, and I think certain events really do change that, you know, and like a pandemic, for instance, that highlights the disparities that we have, you know, in health, that that you're 10 times more likely if you're an indigenous American to get COVID. You're like, you know, 9 more times than a white person if you're a person of color. You know, those kinds of disparities don't just go away, even though I think it highlights those. And that's what you said too, Matt, with the idea that just in the economic piece, that the undergirding elements of that, where some people might have more to fall back on because of that systemic leg up, that it gets through it. You can kind of ride through those hard times, but it really highlights that.
well, you know, in listening to everyone's different stories too, one of the things that I was thinking about is that our church would sponsor different missionaries growing up. Now, you know, you guys are talking about growing up in the 80s and the 90s, and I was growing up in the 60s and the 70s, and it was and I was
we're in a group together.
And I was in a very small town. You know, it was next to Wausau, Wisconsin, which was bigger, and we went there to shop. But, you know, I was very isolated in this, you know, and I mean, you know, we our big thing was the Germans and the Polish, which we did not call Polish. We had other names for them, you know, so there was that ethnic thing that went on where we lived. But anyway, so our church sponsored missionaries, and they would come over, and they would be from African countries. And, you know, our family always ended up hosting them. They would stay overnight. So we would, you know, and thinking about that more, it was almost like that was okay. But going to Milwaukee and going into the area that wasn't all white was not okay. So there was that going on too, when you think about, and these scare stories that got told to us.
Yeah.
You know, when she was talking about, you know, people started worrying about living in one area or another because it might not be safe. And I really wonder, what were the scare stories that occurred that helped promote wanting to have covenants to keep people separate? Because I think there must have been scare stories. Otherwise, people wouldn't have cared as much. And I'm wondering where those were, what they were, where they came from, and who profited,
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So I mentioned last week too that I grew up in South Minneapolis, Longfellow neighborhood, actually like a really diverse neighborhood, and a local, you know, our close school. And the first time that I really remember the kind of hearing about race or the was, so my dad was a pastor. We moved down to a small town for his first call near Owatonna, just south of Owatonna. And when I got to the school, you know, like some of the kids, and I was like the new kid, and I actually started in the spring of my second grade year. And they said, "Oh, you came from Murderapolis. You're from Murderapolis," is what they, you know, that was
Second
what
graders.
Talk about scare stories. That sounds like one to me.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, I heard that consistently from my southern Minnesota town, that you don't want to go up there. It's Murderapolis. You want to go to the Vikings game, and then you want to get the hell out of there. That, you know, that's it. Or go to the Twins game or whatever. Go to Lutheran night at the Twins, and then get the hell out of there. Because that, you know, like there's just, I think you're right. There's fear in that, and there were a lot of those scare stories.
And I guess I think of scare stories as a result of the last 4 years that we had in our national dialogues of, it was all scare stories.
Rapists, murderers, and drug dealers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, no stories about, these are people that are coming for help and we need to be there for them. None of that stories. It was all scare stories. And so that's one of the things, I guess, I don't know if I really heard in this book is, you know, and I'm sure somebody profited it. I think of how development happened.
Yeah.
Or what? How many houses were there in Levittown? Was it 17,000
yeah.
homes?
Yeah.
I mean, what kind of insanity was it to have given a developer that much money?
Well, I mean, clearly there was a demand, and I think, yeah, the some of the responses to Rothstein's book, and I've just, you know, done a few, but one of the things that are the economic factors of it is like who benefits in a capitalist system from racial segregation. You know, that's where generational wealth really does become the linchpin of, you know, of the largest wealth disparity. You know, the wealth gap is housing. That's like what Matt was saying too about equity. Yeah, that, and it, yeah, and that's it's really rooted in a in a Western capitalist mindset as well. And that's a dog, it's a dog eat dog. You don't want you create fear stories so that the Polish or German neighbors or the Scandinavians aren't going to take your house, right? Or aren't going to take your job, or the Mexican immigrants aren't going to take your jobs, right?
Mm-hmm. They're not true, but they're they're good scare stories.
But I think that the elements of kind of the intersection of capitalism too in that, and I think he's saying that through governance is really the means by which it's enforced. The policy.
I wasn't completely persuaded by Rothstein's argument, though, that people don't get it. Or I get that people need to be more educated, but I would think that most Americans understand, like, if you play poker and you cheat at it for 9 hours in a row,
yeah,
and then you stop cheating in the last hour and you play by the rules and everybody has an equal shot,
yeah,
it was still a rigged game. Like, yeah. I don't think that, like, people don't get it. I think a lot of it is more, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah,
at least that's my own opinion.
I don't think some of us want to get it. You know what I mean? I mean, in all reality, when I when I read this book the first time around, I was like, I never thought of it that way. Just never crossed my mind. And now that I've heard it, it's like, oh, no, I have to live in this discomfort of knowing it, or choose to not know it. And a lot of people, I think, choose to not know it.
So you're arguing, Penny, that Rothstein is making a really good point about that people don't really, that they're not aware of. And you think, Tom, that there's more, that people kind of understand that the system is rigged. And you're saying, yeah, that's maybe not.
I think Rothstein, I mean, I learned a ton from this book. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, I think people know that there was 400 years of slavery, or at least they know that there was slavery, most people, up until the Civil War. And I think most people know that, yeah, there was segregation and up through the 50s and 60s enforced by the law. It was perfectly legal, separate but equal, all that stuff. And that really it's maybe only been the last 50 years since things have started trending in a more colorblind way, to use Matt's phrase. So I think most people, would understand that, like, the racial disparities are a function of centuries of getting, the short end of the stick, to put it nicely.
I don't know. I've had discussions with people.
The data, and I do
I've had discussions with a lot of different people about it, and a lot of times the statement is, yeah, but it's been 50 years. I mean, what's the big deal now? That's the statement I hear. So either they don't want to understand it.
Yeah, or we were not responsible for it. So
there's a push there, and I think some of it truly is because it's too uncomfortable for many to look at it, especially abruptly.
Sure.
Discomfort and pain, oftentimes, if you're going to have to go through it, I think people work into it slower, because a great big slicing of the arm is too painful for some. Others, they'd rather just cut it off and get move forward.
I think there has been more data, and I think in the last 20 years, there's more data points, that I think, and obviously the Mapping Prejudice project is still really developing that, like they don't really know where all the racial covenants are, because it's still, but I think that that also could speak to some, for fear of being offensive, some generational gap. Because I think there are, education is a function of different time periods too, and how aware people are of certain things that are going on. And I think in these last, 20 years or whatever, there's just been more, there's been the Michelle Alexanders, there's been a lot of these other books and stuff that have come out that have really shed more light on it too.
And Tom, you might be around more people that get it. I mean, some of the people that I'm thinking of that I've talked to, are just not willing to go there in their thinking.
Thanks, Rita.
Or they'll say, yeah, but.
Yeah.
No, and so I think that we're learning a lot more, but I think there's so much more learning to go forward for people to get to the next point of, I guess we really do need to do something.
Considering
more than what we're doing.
And let's just talk a little bit about where is it? What's that page?
Fixes?
Yeah. So
I found one. Can I ask about it?
Please.
Okay, so on page 205, I thought it was interesting. It was talking about completing a ban on exclusionary zoning is a requirement for inclusionary zoning, a positive effort to integrate low and moderate income families into middle class and affluent neighborhoods. So New Jersey, Massachusetts currently have fair share requirements based on income, not on race. Interesting. And I don't think it's working perfectly, but what an attempt.
Yeah, because I think that's and some of that is the zoning stuff that Rachel was touching on as well, of like multifamily dwellings, which is a new, that's kind of single family homes is kind of dog whistle for when racial covenants were not able to be enforced, that you have zoning that's only for single family homes. And then homeowners associations would come up with, certain square footage requirements as well in that, but then still the multifamily dwelling piece is, and I think that's something that, has been a really tough sell in Washington County, especially. And that's a dog whistle. And I think, that's where some of these policies are trying to combat that.
Well, and it comes about that African Americans weren't allowed to get mortgages, so they couldn't afford the single family dwelling. Yeah. So it was even more than a dog back then. Now it's a dog whistle. Back then it was blatant.
Blatant, yeah.
I love that part about Jackie Robinson. They didn't want to discharge him dishonorably because there would be just unrest because he was already a famous ball player. So, but just for doing something simply as protesting in one of the army towns for not wanting to sit in the back of the bus.
Well, I just read an article this week that I'm forgetting her name, the woman who gave read the poem at Biden's inauguration. She was just followed. She was just followed by a security guard back to her house to prove that she lived there.
Yeah.
That was heartbreaking.
Yeah. That's like, the general manager for this is the only pop culture I follow is the NBA. So this is my only reference really, but the GM for the Toronto Raptors was like on the floor of the NBA finals. And the Raptors were winning and he's like pushed by a security guard as a person of color and asked for his ID and asked for his asked for all of his information, and he's the GM of the team. I think those are, and I think that's where the tentacles of, or the roots, you see kind of some of the roots of racism still. And there's obviously many examples of that too.
I was going to say there's still have news stories out every so often about,
Mhm.
you know, these setups where someone's trying to get a mortgage and same person, or the, you know, the African-American woman has a better record financially than the white male, and she will either be denied, or the interest rate that she's told she can get is significantly higher. So it's
Yeah.
still happening
Based on their name, because they have a more,
based on,
yeah,
because they
just,
know
yeah, I
that
think
they're,
that's been, they've done research now on that too, that
Mhm.
even people's names are, exclusionary, are used.
Well, that female author, Austin Channing, who I can't think of the title of the book right now, it's awesome, but her mom named her a male name so she could
Yeah. And a
be
lot of,
employable,
yeah. Yeah.
hireable.
Did y'all get through the epilogue?
Mhm.
It's just like it's literally 2 pages, but I really like this is where he just goes through this, if we did this, or if this continues to happen. And I think one of the pieces that was brought up too is, this one was really hard to stomach. Like, if police had arrested rather than encouraged leaders of mob violence when African Americans moved into previously white neighborhoods, racial transitions would have been much smoother. So there's like this, it's just a really tough thing to stomach that the state sanctioned violence, the cross burnings that were happening in these neighborhoods, in St. Paul, in
homes with children.
Yeah, with homes with children. Yeah. If those were stopped, if those were put an end to, would that have been enough? I don't, obviously he's got a bunch of different ones that he goes into. But I just think about that too. And
well, this one here where it says, if federal government had not exploited the racial boundaries it had created in metropolitan areas by spending billions on tax breaks for single family suburban homeowners, while failing to spend adequate funds on transportation networks that could bring African Americans to job opportunities, the inequality on which segregation feeds would have diminished. And the sad part about it is so many things that are social challenges in our country, and even economic challenges, are a result of perpetuating the segregation.
That leads to cycles of poverty and ghettoization of communities. Yeah. That
lack of employment, lack of healthcare, lack of, and it's been costly financially and morally, and just as a healthy society.
Yeah.
And yet it seems like we just want to keep doing it.
Yeah. What any of the fixes, in this, like, when you read some of those things, like, are there like, what are your kind of go-to fixes for this stuff? Like, what ones kind of resonate with you as you go through it?
I love the thought of the government buying 15% of Levittown homes and then selling them to African American families for $75,000.
Yeah.
Yep, I agree.
I mean, we subsidize. The problem is we subsidize and support so many things in this country with our tax dollars. It's only certain things that we bitch about. Pardon my French.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Are you saying that no one complains about subsidizing the oil industry?
I would say that. Well, I do, but
but you don't feel like you're in the majority?
I don't know.
I mean, I think that's where, I'm, the mortgage piece, if there's, and I would be more open. I think I would be more open to, significant, mortgage help and support for people to buy homes wherever they want. Um, you know, but I think, and particularly looking at that fair share stuff too, of this is like the percentage of African Americans that are in our community, and yet they're not present in these neighborhoods or whatever. And are there ways that we can boost that?
Even with the Section 8 vouchers, how 1 million in 2015 had vouchers, but another 6 million who qualified.
Yeah,
were
right.
waitlisted.
Yeah,
What,
are
that's
all on the wait.
1/6
It's
of the
like
people have.
10
Yeah.
years. I think it's like 10 years that
Yeah,
people have to wait.
it's outrageously long. I hear
That's
you.
long enough for your kids to live and get asthma and
Yep,
all kinds of things. You think about 10 years in the life of a kid.
Yeah. Well, and I think as an educator, it's actually the first 5 that is like where
Absolutely.
you're set up.
Well,
For,
prenatally. I mean,
Yeah.
so
Right.
so we talk, and that's the other thing when you look at this from the timeline. In one of my classes, we talk about epigenetics, and I have
Okay, I
them
don't know what
watch.
that means.
Okay, I'm gonna explain it.
Thank you.
So
well, Matt's gonna get excited.
I get
now.
excited now.
Look at he's
So,
like,
so I actually have
leaned
them watch a video on a guy who explains it, and he says the egg that produced me was formed in my grandmother's womb.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So everything she was exposed to,
Yeah.
then affected, because my mother was formed in her mother's womb. She already had my egg forming in there, right? So all that exposure determines my outcome. So it's not just that first 5 years, it goes back 2 generations. And even further.
That's almost biblical right there.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
That's the best explanation of epigenetics I've ever heard. So you got it, Sarah.
That's good. That's good. Wow.
Yeah.
But yeah. And again, that whole DNA,
they
it
talk
comes
about
with all
that
that.
transference of trauma.
Yep.
That,
Right,
the
the-
transference
yeah,
of
the
trauma
gen- yeah.
all the way.
Yeah. The epitrauma of that too. Yeah.
And with our Native families, that's such a big deal.
And resilience and likely a ton of resilience too. I think that's where telling the stories of, I think of African Americans who have challenged the system, who have, intentionally moved into communities, white neighborhoods, who have stood up in the face of this is really powerful too. There's an epigenetic element to that too.
So when you talk about solutions, I just remember, it was someone who talked to Adult Forum on the housing stuff that had made the statement that Washington County commissioners are willing to do more affordable housing if they get the support.
Yeah.
And they want to hear from the churches.
Yeah. Yeah, the
to get
faith
the
they want to
support.
hear from the faith.
They want to hear from the faith community that this is something that they want to push for.
Yeah.
So to me, that was the challenge right there of like, okay, so how do we do this?
Yeah.
How do we go about doing this?
You want to know more about that? You could talk to John Hodler, he's really fired up about that right now.
Well, I'll just let John can be, he doesn't need, he can call me if he wants me to do something.
He's probably
He
gonna
would.
call you. He will call you.
But,
I think Penny, that is one of the major challenges is I think local governments, whether they're cities or counties,
Yeah.
if there's a vacuum, if there's not people voicing what they want, then the developers are going to get what they want and the Chamber of Commerce is going to get what they want. And the city councils or the county boards are just going to go along with that because they can just say, well, I don't know whether our residents think we should have our fair share or whether we should have more than our fair share because no one, I'm not getting any emails, I'm not getting any phone calls.
Yeah.
So things must be okay because no one's complaining to me.
Yeah.
So we have a clergy group that's meeting right now, kind of an ecumenical group that's planning to have a meeting with Karen Housley, or Karen Housley, sorry, Karen Housley, who has actually been pretty open to housing, kind of affordable, accessible, creative housing options. But really, I think pressuring those, I think it's about being in relationship with those people who have levers. She's been a senator for 13 years, in the district. And I think there's a huge need in Washington County for affordable housing. There's no shelter currently for, non-family adults, families without any kids, or adults without any kids. There's currently like 106 who are experiencing homelessness in Washington County that are receiving supportive services. So and there's different ways of going about that, but I think ultimately it is those levers that you have to be a part of somehow.
Well, I think I shared the story with one group that I had read an article, I think it was a couple months ago, found out that what I would consider a rural property in Baytown Township was being sold. And the owners of the property really wanted it to go to a conservancy or something like that.
The Bellwin Foundation, I believe. Yeah.
And for some reason, they didn't have the funds or weren't going to do, and it was taking too long. So instead, they sold it off to a developer. And I'm reading the article, and the developer says, "Don't worry, we'll be very responsible with it. All houses will be between $500 and $1 million." And I'm thinking, yeah, like we need any more homes like that. And all I could think of was, here's this big plot of land. And they were talking about, how many acre lots and whatnot. And I'm thinking, no, this is not what we need in this county. And check, sure, sounds good.
Yeah, I used to blame it on having a mayor that was a real estate guy, but I don't think that hasn't been the case for a long time. But it's still happening. And you hear about that.
He's a son of a real estate.
Elmo.
He's a son of a real estate woman, though.
Oh yeah.
Oh, you can tack on what? Now we got 40 some odd years of that. At least,
And
yeah,
Karen
and of course,
is in real estate. She's
yeah,
a real
right,
estate.
right, yeah. And of course you have the Met Council that's been trying to get more dense housing in Lake Elmo for years, and now they're getting it, and it's not the way I would have.
Even the newest housing I have seen built in Lake Elmo, I'm like, all of these are bigger than my house.
Right.
We have fewer children now than we ever have. Why do we need a house that big?
And they're putting it right next to the school that's the most overcrowded in our district.
Is that right?
Yeah, Lake Elmo is super crowded. So, and they're putting and the other thing is that they're doing, well, this has nothing to do with the book, but they're putting them so close together that the fire chief basically said, look, if you get a call, we're going to start 2 houses away. There's no way I'm going to make my guys go between the houses because of the fumes and the heat and everything. They're not going to survive. So we're going to start 2 houses away and just try and keep it from spreading because they have the houses stacked in so tight.
Yeah. So I do think that when they talked about zoning, I think that is the most current system that we have, because we've gone with zoning policies that really restrict and make it prohibitive to create mixed neighborhoods with different economics all within a same neighborhood.
Yeah.
You're building all the same house or the same 3 plans, all with 3,000 square feet. And that does nothing for promoting diversity or providing diversity of any kind. You've got the same economics there, you've got the same race there most likely. And so how do you go about getting that changed? Is that zoning a city thing? Is it a county thing?
Well, Peter,
So-
you asked what some of the solutions might be. So I think it goes back to, well, I start thinking about the African-American people that I know that overcame a lot of this to become successful. And a lot of it was through education. And if I listened, this was months ago, but Justice Alan Page was on the radio. One of his big things, he says, it's all about education. And to me, I'm thinking, well, no, it's not, because you've got all this economic stuff too, right? Well, if we take that and think, okay, it's about education, then we need to integrate our education. We not only need to integrate our education, but we also need to integrate the, not racially, but the type of education we have, right? So at the high school, they get rid of auto shop and the trades and things like that at Stillwater, because they're going to force them all to college. Well, not every kid that goes to Stillwater is going to go to college. Just like not every kid in the inner city is going to become a car repairman, right? So we need to have a mix. We need to have a mix, both racially and
economically,
and goal oriented. Because he talks in there in one of them about it being academically challenging, right, versus vocationally challenging.
I'm going to suggest a book to you, Matt, that you, well, all of you, that it was a highly impactful book to me. It was The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace. Robert Peace. And a Black man from Newark who went to the Ivy League or something like that. It's really, for me, it was a gut-wrenching story. It's a true story. And we're talking about this brilliant young man who was, you would think he would be able to get out. But obviously from the title, there's a tragic story about it. And I'm still exactly not quite sure what to do with it all, but you might find it fascinating in reference to the education piece there, because even with all the education that he was able to get, there were other components,
other barriers,
because of the kind of neighborhood he ended up having to live in, that it made that transition out almost impossible for him.
Yeah, that's where the new Jim Crow book talks a lot about those things, where if you take an African American that's in a high socioeconomic status, they still have much worse outcomes than a white person of a lower middle class socioeconomic status. And a lot of it is the way society is viewing them. Like we said, and I keep forgetting her name. You know, she got followed home, for crying out loud.
Amanda Gorman.
Amanda, thank you. Yes.
I think one of the things that, you know, people kind of, or at least this a little bit for me too, but the idea of social engineering, and, you know, and I think Rothstein says that even our fixes will, you know, there's going to be no silver bullet here, right? There's going to be no complete fix all to what's going to deal with the complexity of of racial issues. But I think he encourages us to try nonetheless. And I think that's where I'm just kind of curious of your for me, it seems that so much of our societies have been socially engineered, and the only way out of it is to be reverse, you know, socially engineered policy wise out of it. And that's, I think, what Ta-Nehisi, or not Ta-Nehisi Coates, but Ibram X. Kendi says too, is
absolutely,
you know, it's not about people. This is ultimately about policies that are going to shape and money. And I think, you know, what is the reverse? What is the, you know, what is the kind of specific responses to specific places? And as we get better data on, you know, the ways in which our communities have been segregated intentionally, are there specific solutions, you know, to the Levitt towns or to the Lake Elmos or to the these places to reverse it?
You have an answer, right?
Yeah.
You're great at that term, social engineering. What does that feel to you? I'm just curious.
Oh, it scares me.
Yeah.
I
But
think entitlement.
yeah, but I do recognize what Kendi says, that it's going to be a pendulum swinging the other way.
Yeah, it's got to be. Yeah, for sure. And Rothstein does have an interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates. I haven't listened to the whole thing.
A recent one, Peter?
Pretty, yeah, 2015. Yeah, 2015. Not real recent. But if you that might be another thing too. If we want to, if there are things you want to share throughout this next week, maybe we could do a little, if there's other things you want to point people to that you found helpful. I think the short and tragic life of that would be a good thing. But some of these other kind of, where do we go from here next?
I'm not saying it's a great model, but it's a model that I'm growing more familiar with, which is the price of college education, which I think is less transparent than the price of airline tickets. But I mean, it is the notion that the incoming class of whatever you want to call it, university, are all going to get more or less the same experience, right? They're going to have the same offering of classes that they can select from, the same dorms that they would stay in or whatever. But the prices that people pay for that are going to differ pretty dramatically, for the most part, based on their economic circumstances, right? The ability to pay, or there's a certain merit component to it, but it's really more, I just filled them out in the last 6 months. I mean, they ask, you fill out the FAFSA, and then you fill out another one that asks you even more questions about where you might be hiding your money. And then the colleges can make an informed decision about how much you should pay. And real estate's nothing like that, right? And I'm not saying that the way college prices itself is great. I think there's probably a lot of room for reform there.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
But I mean, you basically have some people pay more than the more than the cost of the good, and you have some people pay less than the cost of the good. And when you look at housing anyway, like just, I don't know, I took classes on it in law school and stuff, and the joke is, like, people like love property rights. Americans love property rights. It's my home, it's my castle, or whatever. There isn't probably anything you own that's more regulated than your home, right? Down to exactly how far apart the studs need to be, to how many fire things you need. It's highly regulated, right? And
population that might not want to hear that term with their home.
probably not. But I don't know, if you've ever been to Mexico, and stayed somewhere that's like not just in a home, like the craftsmanship that you see in some of these homes is amazing. And you're like, wow, like this brickwork or this stucco work or this masonry is amazing. Like, to build a house like this in the United States would cost $1 million, right? Because of the cost of labor and materials and how it's regulated and everything else. And I'm not saying we should go back to building things like people build things in Mexico, but like the cost of buying a new house, even if you want 1,800 square feet, and you want a small plot of land to live, whatever, a sixth of an acre or whatever it would be, that's $350,000. Right. I mean, unless you're going to put up a tiny home or something like that, or you're going to come up with a really unique way of cutting the costs, just building an average house, not even an average house, like a starter home. It's outside of what many people can afford.
I wonder if do they build new homes at 1,000 square feet anymore? I wonder.
Not unless they're forced to. Not unless that's not unless that's in order to build the $1 million homes, the city's going to make me build a few $250,000 homes.
I mean, when I think about it, the first home we owned was 950 square feet.
Yeah, and the United States is one of the few. So the U.S. is one of the few places that looks as a home as an investment. Most other places, it's a cost. Right. So in Europe or whatever, you don't really own anything, and you might own it, but again, it's just most often you're renting. And so it's an expense. It's not an investment. And then certain population here has to look at that as an expense and not an investment because they aren't allowed to invest.
Right.
So that's an interesting, a whole interesting different conundrum.
Canada too, there's not like a 30-year mortgage in Canada where you can use the value of the house as the collateral against the loan. Like it's a pretty American way of doing it.
Yeah.
You know, just, and maybe this is a good place to end or another place to begin, but you know, I think about that college situation, Tom, just in general, how, right, some people are going to pay more than the goods, right? And then lucky student who will be not entitled at all, underprivileged, and will get something. And I've read articles about it, and they end up in this amazing school, yet money always seems to win, because even though they might have struggled in some class, their roommate got the money for the private tutor, for the all the extra things that come with a parent with money. So they're in this situation, and what kind of support? I mean, I'm sure in some places they are getting support, but money always wins, and I don't like that. So I'm not anti-capitalism, but there's got to be a way of partnering with others, not white savior stuff, because I'm sick of hearing about that, but there's got to be a way of partnering with one another so that we can figure things out with more equity.
But there are ways that both can win. I mean, money's always going to win, but you can have other people win as well.
I hope.
But you bringing up that idea, though, that idea that the United States is more unique in the idea of that's where our homes become so much of our wealth.
Right.
So is that partly because we are not willing to pay for socialized medicine and things like that? How retirement works? I mean, I'm just wondering.
Yeah, no, it's a good question.
Why is it important in our economy such that it's made such inequities?
I think it goes back to Go West Young Man, right? The 40-acre homestead, right? If you could plot it out, you could keep it, right? We had so much space that the only thing we could give away was land, right? So that was a commodity that we had. Whereas if you're in Europe or wherever, you don't have any room to go get your own place. You are in a high rise or whatever.
I think it's also partly just like the mid 20th century. We're going to build all these homes. People are going to buy them, and you're going to take out loans that 30-year loan, and you're going to pay it back a little bit at a time, and like you're going to own your home, and that's part of the American dream.
It's really interesting thought.
Yeah, I think we've got some good things to keep wondering about together. If you find some intersection about, I'd love to read more about that. How different countries value different things, because that's a thought I didn't even cross my mind.
I know when Elizabeth went to Germany, the family she stayed with, she said that the home that the family lived in was kind of like a generational family home. That it stayed in the family. It was made out of stone, not wood.
Yeah.
So she said, so even if there was a fire, not everything was destroyed, and they would rebuild. And that was a structure that lasted for hundreds of years. Yeah. And it was just something that was with family. And so that family, now they had a smaller place next door that some of the other family lived in. So they had 2 family units with extended families living in it.
And that's the other thing that's the other thing in America that drives it is the farm family, right? You have a whole bunch of kids. Yeah. Well, you're not going to have 6 families living in in a house that one family used to live in. So you got to spread out somewhere.
Yeah.
And I know we're over time, but I work with people in Seattle, and it's, you know, people throw parties out there when somebody buys a house because it's so much of it's even for whatever race you are. It's the point where like owning a home out there or in Silicon Valley, it's like you're gonna rent the whole time you're out there unless money starts raining from the sky, and then you might be able to buy a house.
Yeah. My buddy's an engineer at Boeing, and back in the late 90s, he bought an 800 square foot house, and he was so excited. And I think he paid 3 times what I paid for, 1,500 square foot house.
Yeah.
It's big.
Very interesting
Big part.
discussion.
Yeah, really interesting.
My son just got 2 months free rent, he and his girlfriend, because there are some vacancies in Minneapolis right now. And
Wow.
2 months free rent, which is a huge deal for the next, because they signed an 18-month lease, and he was able to, he's the cheapest person I know, talk the garage down to underground parking for $35 a month. Go figure.
Nice.
So to get 2 months rent free, that's a big
Pretty
deal.
good.
When you're
I pay over $100 a month to park at the U.
I know. And this is in Northeast, Matt. This is in
Wow.
Northeast. So, yeah. So I don't know. Being a renter sometimes sounds okay too.
Yeah. All right, y'all. Thank you.
Peter,
Happy
for
St. Patrick's Day.
organizing us. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, you too. Yeah,
See you next week.
You got your green on, Tom. Yeah.
Thanks.
You got a green wall, Penny.
That's right.
I know. I'm in the other room tonight.
Oh, you got green on your glasses too, Sarah.
I count.
You're good.
Have a good
All right,
one, you
see you
guys.
later.
See ya. Bye-bye.
Good night.